The village of Hollow Creek was a place forgotten by time. Nestled deep in a valley, it was shrouded in mist and silence. At its heart stood a crumbling manor, its windows like vacant eyes. Villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, their faces etched with fear. They called it Whispering Shadows, a place where darkness lingered. One crisp autumn evening, a lone traveller named Arif stumbled upon Hollow Creek. He had heard tales of the village and its haunted manor. As a scholar of the unknown, his curiosity was piqued. The villagers warned him against going near the manor. They shared stories of those who had entered but never returned. Their pleas fell on deaf ears. Arif, convinced their fears were mere superstition, was determined to uncover the truth. The manor loomed before him, its facade crumbling like a forgotten dream. Ivy snaked its way up the walls, seeking to reclaim the stone. The windows, dark and empty, seemed to watch his every move. A low whistle of wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a faint whisper. Arif paused, his hand hovering over the tarnished doorknob. Had he imagined it? He pushed the door open, stepping across the threshold. The air inside was stale and cold, heavy with the scent of decay. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight that pierced the gloom. He could hear the faint scuttling of rats in the walls and the creak of floorboards under his feet, but there was something else too. A low hum of energy, barely perceptible, thrumming beneath the surface. It was as if the house itself were alive. He moved deeper into the house, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Each room he entered was a portrait of decay. Furniture lay draped in dust sheets, their shapes barely discernible in the gloom. Paint peeled from the walls, revealing faded murals of forgotten faces. And always, there were the whispers. They seemed to follow him, growing louder with each step he took. They spoke his name, their voices a chorus of shadows. He found himself drawn to a grand staircase at the end of a long corridor. The steps creaked ominously under his weight as he ascended. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging him upward. They seemed to emanate from the top floor, beckoning him towards some unknown destination. He reached the top of the stairs and paused, his hand resting on the intricately carved banister. A long, narrow hallway stretched before him, lit by a single flickering gas lamp. The portraits lining the walls seemed to watch him as he passed, their eyes following his every move. He could feel a presence here, something ancient and malevolent, watching him from the shadows. The air grew colder, biting at his skin. He pulled his coat tighter around himself, his breath misting in the frigid air. He reached the end of the hallway and found himself facing a heavy wooden door. It was locked, but the wood around the handle was splintered and worn. It was clear that someone had tried to break in, or perhaps out, with a desperation that sent chills down Arif's spine. He took a step back, his mind racing. What had he stumbled upon? And what were the whispers trying to tell him? Taking a deep breath, Arif pressed his shoulder against the door. It creaked open, revealing a small, dusty room. A single window boarded up from the inside cast the room in perpetual twilight. In the center of the room stood a writing desk, its surface covered in scattered papers and a single flickering candle. As Arif stepped closer, he could see that the papers were covered in faded ink, the writing spidery and illegible. He picked up one of the papers, his fingers tracing the faded script. The words were written in a language he didn't recognize, but as he read, he could feel a cold dread creeping up his spine. The words seemed to writhe on the page, filled with a palpable sense of despair and fear. It was as if the writer had poured their very essence into the ink, leaving behind a residue of their torment. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind him, plunging the room into darkness. The candle on the desk sputtered and died, leaving Arif alone in the suffocating blackness. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the whispers swirling around him, closer now, their voices filled with a mocking laughter. They were no longer whispering, they were chanting, their voices echoing in the confines of the small room. Panic welled up inside Arif. He fumbled for the door handle, but it was gone. He was trapped. The chanting grew louder, reverberating through his bones. He could feel the floor beneath his feet begin to vibrate, as if the very foundation of the house were shifting. The air grew thick and heavy, suffocating him. He gasped for breath, but his lungs felt as if they were filled with cotton. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the chanting stopped. The vibrations ceased. A heavy silence descended upon the room, broken only by the sound of Arif's ragged breathing. He slumped against the wall, his body trembling with fear. He had to get out of this house. He had to escape. But where could he go? As if in answer to his question, he heard a faint scratching sound coming from the far corner of the room. He turned towards the noise, his eyes struggling to penetrate the darkness. As his vision adjusted, he realized with a growing sense of dread that the scratching was coming from a trapdoor in the floor. He had read about houses like this, old houses with hidden rooms and secret passages. He had never believed they were real until now. Cautiously, Arif approached the trapdoor. The scratching sound grew louder as he drew closer, accompanied now by a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down his spine. He knelt down, his hand hovering over the handle. What lay beneath? Was it another room, another clue to the mystery of whispering shadows? Or was it something far more sinister? He hesitated for a moment, his better judgment warring with his insatiable curiosity. Taking a deep breath, he threw open the trapdoor. A blast of stale, musty air assaulted his senses, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay and something else, something ancient and evil. The growling grew louder, closer. He peered into the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. A pair of glowing eyes met his gaze from the bottom of the stairs. They were the only source of light in the otherwise impenetrable blackness. They stared up at him with a cold, malevolent intelligence that made his blood run cold. He backed away from the trapdoor, his mind reeling. What had he unleashed? A low growl rumbled from the depths of the trapdoor, followed by the scraping of claws on wood. Something was climbing up from the darkness, something monstrous. Arif scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He had to get out of there, had to escape before it was too late. He turned to run, but a heavy weight slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. He cried out in pain as he felt sharp claws dig into his flesh. He thrashed against his attacker, but it was no use. It was too strong. He could feel its hot, fetid breath on his face as it dragged him towards the open trapdoor. His screams echoed through the empty house, unanswered. He was alone, at the mercy of whatever creature lurked in the darkness below. He caught one last glimpse of the moonlit room, of the scattered papers on the writing desk, before he was plunged into the suffocating blackness of the basement. Then, silence. The house held its breath, as if savoring its victory. The whispers, for a moment, were still. The next morning, dawn broke over Hollow Creek, casting a pale light on the village below. The villagers emerged from their homes, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and resignation. Another night had passed, and the manor on the hill remained standing, a silent testament to the darkness that resided within its walls. They spoke in hushed tones of the stranger who had arrived the night before, the one who had ignored their warnings and ventured into the cursed house. They had heard his screams in the night, echoing through the stillness. They knew what had become of him. They had always known. A group of brave souls armed with pitchforks and lanterns made their way up the hill towards the manor. They knew it was a fool's errand, but they had to try. They had to see if there was anything left of the stranger to bury. As they approached the house, they could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon them, watching their every move. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of decay and the promise of violence. The villagers entered the manor, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. They searched every room, every nook and cranny, but their search proved fruitless. There was no sign of the stranger, no trace of his struggle. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. They stood in the foyer, their faces pale with fear, their eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to dance at the edge of their vision. They knew the truth, even if they didn't want to admit it. The manor had claimed another victim, its hunger for souls insatiable. They had risked their lives for nothing. As they turned to leave, they heard it. A faint whisper carried on the wind. It was a single word, spoken in a voice both ancient and filled with malice. Lost. The villagers exchanged terrified glances. The whispers had returned, and they were hungry. The villagers fled from the manor, their terror lending speed to their steps. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of the village, their lungs burning, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had escaped with their lives, but they knew they had been forever changed by their encounter with the darkness that resided within whispering shadows. The manor stood on the hill, silhouetted against the rising sun. It was a place of whispers and shadows, of forgotten memories and unspeakable horrors. It had claimed countless souls over the centuries, and it would claim countless more. For Whispering Shadows was more than just a house. It was a living nightmare, feeding on the fear of those who dared to cross its threshold. And the whispers, they grew louder, bolder, echoing through the empty corridors of the manor, reaching out into the village below. They were searching, hunting for their next victim, and they would not be silenced until another soul was claimed. The cycle would continue, a never-ending spiral of fear and despair. For in Hollow Creek, some stories never die, they simply fade into whispers.